Let me stand here, not least because like this I will see you all better. Let me start by making an observation about what we have just experienced with Kailash. That is the force and power of one idea and one individual. And I think for all the challenges, for all the difficulties that we have experienced in the year about to conclude, I continue to remain convinced that one at a time, every one of us can make a difference. I would like also, let me start also by saying thank you to the organizers of this very important conference for having me here, but thank you even more for choosing a very interesting topic, democracy and human rights, development for people and by the people, and putting it in a very, very new and refreshing way. Usually the question is, does democracy, do human rights help development? In a sense, right now, we are looking at it the other way around. Does development help? And can it help promoting democracy and human rights? There is a biunevocal relation between the two. The one without the other cannot work. I'm sure you're thinking of examples of countries that have experienced development without respect for human rights, without open and democratic societies. First question, is it really development? I don't want to go into a long definitional discussion, but development is much more than economic growth. We cannot equate it with that. We've had many instances, we still have, of countries who experience economic growth, but also experience great inequalities, exclusion, discrimination. In the long term, this is not sustainable. Sorry. This always happens, I don't know why. When member states committed about almost 70 years ago to the UN Charter, what they pledged to achieve was better standards of life in larger freedom. Already then, and that's why I think these are such insightful words, they recognized that there cannot be a better standard of life without freedom. They agreed to cooperate in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all. And they did this because they had experienced what can happen whenever there is no framework of norms and values commonly shared to set out what are the responsibilities of governments towards their citizens as well as towards one another. They were emerging from a terrible world war, from the horrors of the Holocaust, a long period of economic depression that had preceded those two sad events, and they recognized that states have a responsibility to ensure for their citizens freedom from fear, but also freedom from want. And what they knew is that without human rights, any peace is unsustainable. If there is no justice, agreements are just paper. And if there is no respect for equality and dignity, development is really by the many in support of only the few. So the job of a state, and this is important, we talk in human rights terms about states being the duty bearer, and indeed they are, as laid out by the United Nations, was to establish the framework which would be crucial to safeguard the peace, frameworks that would promote human rights, for all, and promote strong and sustainable progress in development. These are the three dimensions which are also to this day the three pillars of United Nations actions, and the one without the others would not be achievable. When all goes well, so these elements come together, they form a single and flexible but powerful force for democracy, human rights, and development, for the people and by the people. You have to see them together. If you have the right to vote, what does it really mean if you have no right to education, or you can have no freedom of expression? So you tick a box and then what? If people have to live in dignity, how can they do so without having access to food and health and sanitation and all the basic rights that are so important for a dignified life? And so we as development professionals, and I consider myself one among them, we really cannot say that we have achieved progress if we have halved the rate, the number of people living in poverty, but in the process have left over 1 billion still living with less than $1 a day. And at the same time we have, I don't have the exact number, 1,600 and something billionaires in the world. Something really doesn't work. So, and if we look at those of us privileged to live in industrialized, rich societies, even here, the gap between the rich and the poor is the widest that it has been over the last 30 years. So we know, as development practitioners, that debate and an open voice for all stakeholders is key to identifying and responding to development needs. Amartya Sen said it, and my former boss Helen Clark just quoted Amartya Sen. It is an important researcher and thinker whose ideas have really been important. What he said was also, no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent country with a democratic government and a relatively free press. Here they come together, all three again. Development, human rights, democracy. So participation, accountability, non-discrimination, due process, these are fundamental building blocks for democracy and for sustainable development. And the founding members of the UN realized it fully and recognized also that they build resilience to crisis. People have to be able to trust the governments and the system of justice. This creates societies that are more stable, more resilient, and more secure. When development is equitable and inclusive, it also generates societies that can resist to inner conflict. Many states have been thinking that they could create high growth with what is perhaps defined as authoritarian capitalism, but this is not possible. And let me underline why. First of all, a regime that crushes dissent and expression destroys its warning system. It's exactly when people start saying we are unhappy about something that it is possible for a regime to recognize that something has to be done and take the necessary policy measures. When there is repression, inequalities increase and corruption bloats. Secondly, civil and political liberties are not divisive per se. They contribute to generating unity because it's exactly by discussing where the differences are that you can find some common ground. Freedom of expression, moreover, frankly, is pretty cheap. It's repressing the freedom of expression that is very expensive to state. Think about the security apparatuses that they have to set up, the surveillance measures and so on. This drains enormous resources from development. Shutting down the internet, arresting journalists or human rights defenders, what a waste of resources. And finally, I think there's no theoretical or empirical link between oppression of dissent, repression of dissent, and economic progress. A government, therefore, that ignores freedom, equality, and rights is really a poor government. It is a weak one. It's a government that is afraid of its own citizens. And so it's important to ensure that voices are heard, because when they are repressed, unfortunately, we see it very much these days, that's when people radicalize. When they feel there is no outlet, that's when the expression risks becoming a more forceful and at times violent one. And finally, just to remember that governments are not there to serve themselves, but to serve the people. The Secretary General of the UN said it very recently. He noted, if leaders do, I quote, if leaders do not listen to the people, they will hear from them in the streets, in the square, and as we see far too often, on the battlefield. But he went on to say, there is a better way: more participation, more democracy, more engagement and openness. And this is important because it builds a relationship of trust between governments and citizens. When opportunities are provided based on merit, participation is inclusive. These are very strong antidotes against conflict. If we look at what is coming up now, we are right in a very important year. The discussion of the post-2015 development agenda will be one of the points at which we as collective international community will be judged by history. Are we going to be able to agree on a framework that will take us for the next 15 years in the right direction, and in the right direction for all? This is an opportunity that we cannot afford to miss. The working group outcome document and the Secretary General synthesis report, which has just been issued last week, are very important because they recognize the need to ground the post-2015 agenda in democracy and human rights. It is goal 16, as the Minister has just said, but it's also the way the other goals are designed that will be important, because they are designed to ensure fighting exclusion, fighting discrimination, and ensuring that this goal indeed apply to all. We have also a strong emphasis on 2 equality goals and targets on laws, policies, and actions that are very directly addressing marginalized groups, and importantly make the point that in order to do that, we have to be very mindful about data collection, and data analysis. There are some issues still in the post-2015 development framework. There are some potential weaknesses. Of course, none of us is perfect, nor are we, in fact, collectively. But there are a few priorities that I would like to underline for the next phase of negotiations as important to make sure that we do move in the right direction. First, as the Secretary General's report suggests, critical to ensure that the goals and targets are measurable, achievable, and that means realistic, but sufficiently aspirational to force us all to stretch ourselves a bit. Importantly, they have to be consistent with existing UN and international standards, including, of course, for human rights. And here let me say one serious preoccupation I have is that in the current working group outcome document, there are some references that are of concern. Whenever we talk about, for instance, targets for human rights in accordance with national legislation, what does this mean when the national legislation is not in conformity with the international standards, is in itself repressive, constraining, and not recognizing women's rights? So I think we will need to work to address this serious concern. Secondly, it will be critical to keep a balanced development agenda looking at freedom from want and freedom from fear, therefore looking at the civil and political side, as well as the economic, social, and cultural. And I think it's time to debunk the perceived dichotomy that is perhaps an inheritance of the Cold War period, where one set of rights, civil and political, is sort of looked as the opposite of the economic, social, and cultural. They have to be together. And so it will be important to continue to preserve Goal 16, which is essentially the only one that intentionally focuses on civil and political rights. It will be through work on ensuring that the goals reflect freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and very importantly, a focus on justice and accountability that will make the post-2015 agenda a success. Thirdly, and here I know I'm looking to one of the most committed partners in this context, the financing of these goals will be important. We cannot achieve the results that we set out if we don't support them financially. And for that, it's important to build a strong partnership that goes beyond the perception of the donor countries. We are partners. We have to work together. And yes, there is a responsibility to achieve the 0.7% ODA contribution, but it's also important for countries where collectively we engage to look at their own priorities. Where do they put the funding? Is it going to education or is it going to defense because they expect someone else to fund education? So the enabling international environment will be important, but the policy coherence at the global as well as national level will be important as well. Fourth point for the post-2015 development agenda is monitoring. It's very nice to decide what we want to do, but we also have to make sure that we know that we are going there where we said we wanted to go. And therefore, it's important to invest in development of indicators and investing in making sure that we set the baselines and we monitor and measure the progress. These seem very mundane activities, but otherwise, how can we say whether we are making progress or not? And I would like to debunk the perception that the governance goal is not measurable. There are lots of indicators that can be used to measure whether a country or an institution is transparent, accountable, well managed, not corrupt, and so on. So targets have to be set precisely with baselines and with indicators to measure them. And finally, I think it's important to create a web of accountability that allows for participation. We've seen how important it has been to have a broad-based dialogue in discussing the priorities for the post-2015 agenda, and Helen Clark was just talking about that, and the broad-based consultation. Well, we need to practice the same good practice also when we go to monitoring and accountability. There has to be peer review at the global level, but also reviews at the national level to ensure that we are moving in the right direction. So what we need and what we are striving for, and I look to Norway as one of the strong partners to strive in that direction together with us in the UN, is a universal vision that recognizes that human rights and development are not just interdependent, we say that, but also in very practical terms, they're inseparable. They just conceptually don't stand on their feet, the one without the other. And an agreement on the post-2015, therefore, should not just include states, the UN family, the multilateral development actors whose policies can generate change. They also have to be broadly shared with us as, well, what the Charter talks about, we, the peoples. We have to have a say, and this has to be underpinned by a general commitment to human rights. Human rights are not a distraction from a main event. They are the event. Economic growth without human rights is just a poor shadow of what development really is. And if we deny full expression of the talents of every individual, we will end up by holding back the whole of society. So we will be living up to the promises of the UN Charter and to the full dimension of development the moment we really make equality, human dignity, rights and freedoms our common objective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.